I'm Michael Lambert, a fellow in social inequalities here at Lancaster University. And today I'm going to be speaking about researching inequalities and what this involves. So can I begin by asking who am I speaking with? Who are you?
So I'm Daisy May Barker. I'm a second year PhD student at Sociology department in Lancaster. Also did my master's and my undergraduate degrees here, and I am funded by the Economic Social Research Council on a full 1+3 scholarship. And my PhD is supervised by our head of department, Imogen Tyler, and also Bev Skeggs.
And so what is it that you do?
So I'm currently working on my PhD project, which is currently entitled The COVID-19 Pandemic, Gendered Labour and Crisis, Lived Experiences of the Collapse of the Political Economy of Social Reproduction, which is a bit of a tongue twister to say. So I'll break it down a bit. So starting with social reproduction, that's just a different word that I use instead of care due to how that enables us to sort of think about care in a wider sort of capitalist process. So social reproduction is sort of the mental, manual, and emotional labour that goes into, everyday daily processes of life making and rearing, and both, on a daily process, but also generational process as well. And I sort of go beyond the social reproduction conceptualizations of this to not only focus on that in terms of a form of labour, but also a responsibility, quite literally a responsibility of, a matter of life and death. So then when we link that into, what do I mean by the political economy of social reproduction, I take a sort of institutional approach and I look at the different institutions in society that sort of, balance the power and the labour and the responsibility for social reproduction across the state, the market, third sector, and the home. So, for example, a state institution of social reproduction might be the school, whereas, a market might be one might be like a private nursery. A third sector institution of social reproduction might be a food bank. And then obviously the home is, the domestic space that we're all attached to, and sort of how that's reconfigured in times of crisis. But specifically, the crisis that I'm focusing on is the COVID-19 pandemic. In sort of the main conceptualization of my thesis will be how the COVID-19 pandemic has led to the collapse of the political economy, social reproduction. And by that, I sort of mean, like the key sort of how these key institutions collapsed overnight through either the limited capacities or, completely, like when we think of the school, just completely closed and sort of, people had to, go away and do homeschooling. But then on the opposite side of that, how third sector institutions such as food banks, went into overdrive. And, I think the Morecambe Bay Food Bank delivered 38,000 parcels over the pandemic. So sort of thinking about those immediate issues, sort of, through lockdown, alongside the reorganisation of the workforce as well, sort of thinking about this, new essential worker category, and then always linking that back to the wider processes, the wider historical issues in which, social reproduction is constantly being privatised and financialised through neoliberal capitalism.
What I find straight away, you sort of talking about your research and these kind of processes, is that, as you know, the Centre for Alternatives to Social and Economic Inequalities kind of ethos is to think globally about inequalities but act locally. And I'd say your research is the living embodiment of this in how you do it. So that leads me on to the next question, is that you've got this very complex and contingent understanding of these bigger structural and theoretical things that you're interested in, and the kind of the moments in time through crisis that you're studying. So how do you get under the skin of such a big issue, and sort of the research in terms of methods, analysis, and approach that you adopt?
Yeah, so I think, one of the other main things in my title that I haven't really touched on is taking this lived experience approach of the collapse of the political economy of social reproduction. I think we've got a lot of work that is brilliant theoretically, attacking these different issues, but is so far removed from the material realities of what's actually going on. So I do that by taking this lived and local approach methodologically via feminist ethnographic methods. So at the minute, I'm sort of working out how I'm going to do that in my second year. But that's going to be embedding myself in a third sector institution, which is local to Lancaster. And through that, I'm hoping to do observations via shadowing different people who do different roles in that sector institution. So that will be, doing interviews with people who not only use that service, but also people who work in it to sort of get an idea of that unpaid and paid social reproductive work that's going on. Because also in third sector institutions, a lot of it is voluntary. So there's another interesting relation going on there. Um, so yeah, I'm thinking methodologically, I'm sort of dealing with these sort of different issues around, temporality as well, because I'm sort of looking at what's happened, very recent history, only, 2020, 2021, through the various different lockdowns, but also what that means for now. So sort of looking at the initial collapse of this political economy of social reproduction, but also looking at its collapsibilities, especially as we go into, the winter of 2021. By collapsibility, I mean sort of how, once, for example, if we go back to the institution of a school, because I think that's one that a lot of people understand and have experienced. Once, the school closed and, you had to do homeschooling and stuff. Well, now we've still got issues around, for example, look at the rates of, COVID in children at the minute, unfortunately. Schools are closing, bubbles bursting, whatever sort of terminology they're using at the time. Just looking at how people are still living with this constant collapse of these relations and what that means for their labour and responsibility.
So hearing you speak so eloquently about these kinds of bigger issues and how you're going to grapple with them and how you wrap around this understanding, can I just ask you to give me one example of how your work intersects with this issue of inequalities?
Yeah, so I suppose it's really hard to give one example because social reproduction itself is just fraught with different forms of inequalities and obviously is in this constant state of crisis. But I think at the minute, one of the most important things that I'm sort of grappling with in relation to inequalities is sort of how certain individuals are disproportionately impacted by the collapse of the political economy in multiple different ways. So I think firstly, it relates to sort of the geographical location, coming back to this issue of the importance of local political economy research, specifically related to social reproduction. Just looking at how different areas responded differently and how particularly really deprived areas were hit really bad by different, the different forms of lockdown we went through. And then also looking at different individuals' social position and how that impacted it. And by that, I mean, not only, their class, race, gender, etc., but also, the roles that they hold within the political economy of social reproduction. So we had, a lot of individuals that were particularly crushed by this collapse because they hold both paid and unpaid roles within this political economy of social reproduction. And obviously from a lot of both quantitative statistics and qualitative research that's now starting to come out, we know that these people tend to be working class, Black, Asian, ethnic minority women due to how this, the work of social reproduction and its responsibility is really gendered. So yeah, I think as well, another issue that sort of goes alongside that labour responsibility is also disproportionate exposure to the virus as well, which we've seen not only through, the, uneven death rates when we, break that down, So yeah, just thinking about how social reproduction comes back to that issue of, well, who takes on the labour of responsibility for this, life making and life rearing in these sort of necropolitical conditions, really, by that, how certain decisions by the government sort of, decides, well, who lives and who dies, but also who does the work to make sure that those processes do or don't happen. So yeah.
And I've got one final question, but you've already talked a lot about and around this already in the answers that you've given. So apologies for sort of pushing this further. So beyond the Economic and Social Research Council funding your research, can you tell me about any groups, bodies or partners you're involved with as part of this?
Yeah, so my ethnographic field work is very much supported by the Morecambe Bay Poverty Truth Commission, which the department works quite closely with. But I've also written for the Sociological Review. I've presented for the Women's Budget Group and other institutions, such as the Gender and Work Centre at Cambridge University, and I'm also currently working on a series of events which are also related to KSI, with the Transforming Care Economies group.
Fantastic, and thanks for taking the time out to talk with me about how your research relates to inequalities.
Yeah, no problem.
Thanks.